Someone you loved is gone, the body is there, the warmth has left it, and you have absolutely no idea what to do next. That feeling, that paralysis, that disorientation, that strange mix of grief and practicality is not a modern problem. It is not a cultural failure. It is one of the oldest experiences your species has ever had. And the real answer to how your ancestors handled it is far stranger, far more tender, and far more revealing about who you actually are than anything you were ever taught in school. Most people assume that ancient humans barely paused when death arrived, that they were too busy surviving to grieve, that they dragged the body away, maybe tossed it in a ditch, and moved on to the next crisis. That emotion was a luxury evolution hadn't quite figured out yet. But the evidence says something completely different. Your ancestors buried their dead with flowers. They painted ochre on the bones. They carried the skulls of loved ones for years, sometimes decades, after death. They left food beside graves. They sang. They mourned. And they did all of this long before anyone built a city, wrote a law, or invented a religion. Death ritual is not a product of civilization. It is a product of being human. The oldest known intentional burial on record dates back roughly 300,000 years, discovered deep inside the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa. Paleoanthropologist Lee Berger and his team uncovered what appears to be deliberate burial behavior in a species called Homo naledi, a creature with a brain roughly 1/3 the size of yours. This matters enormously. For decades, scientists assumed that complex death ritual required complex cognition. Berger's discovery suggests that something far more ancient, far more instinctual, was already at work long before your brain reached its current size. Your ancestors didn't invent grief because they were smart. They were already grieving before they were smart. Go back even further. About 430,000 years ago, in a cave in northern Spain called the Cima de los Huesos, which translates hauntingly as the Pit of Bones, researchers discovered the skeletal remains of at least 28 individuals, all of them Homo heidelbergensis, stacked deep in a pit that could only have been reached by deliberately carrying bodies through narrow underground passages. There were no signs of predator activity, no evidence of accident. Paleoanthropologist Juan Luis Arzuaga, who has spent decades studying this site, concluded that these bodies were placed there intentionally. Something moved those people to carry their dead into the dark, to lower them into the earth, to mark the moment. What you feel when you lose someone, that compulsive need to do something, to not just leave, that instinct is nearly 500,000 years old. But what did they actually do? What did the ritual look like? It varied. It was creative. It was intimate in ways that might surprise you. The Neanderthals, your closest extinct relatives who lived alongside your direct ancestors for tens of thousands of years, almost certainly practiced burial. In a site called Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, archaeologist Ralph Solecki discovered a Neanderthal burial surrounded by dense clusters of pollen from flowers, including yarrow, groundsel, and grape hyacinth. This became one of the most debated findings in paleoanthropology. Some researchers challenged whether the flowers were placed deliberately or carried in by burrowing rodents. But more recent analysis of sediment at the site has reopened the conversation, and many researchers now believe that the flowers were intentional, that a Neanderthal was lowered into the earth on a bed of blossoms. Think about that. A being who had never read a poem, never attended a funeral, never been taught that flowers mean love, that being picked flowers for its dead. Your need to make death beautiful is not learned. It runs deeper than culture. Among early modern humans, the rituals become even more elaborate. At a site called Sungir in Russia, about 34,000 years old, archaeologists found the graves of an adult male and 2 adolescents buried head to head. What stopped researchers in their tracks was what surrounded the bodies. Over 13,000 ivory beads, each one individually carved from mammoth tusk, were arranged in patterns that could only have been sewn onto clothing. The beads on the adult's arm suggest decorated bracelets. The arrangement of beads across the children suggests elaborate garments or possibly a canopy. Thousands of hours of skilled labor went into preparing these bodies for burial. These were not people who barely paused. These were people who stopped everything and worked for days or weeks to send their dead away properly. Researcher Randall White, who has studied sun gear extensively, estimates that producing just the adult male's 3,000 beads would have required over 10,000 hours of labor. 10,000 hours. 10,000 hours. For one burial. For one person whose name you will never know. That is not primitive behavior. That is love made physical by people who had no word for it yet. But grief didn't end at the graveside. In many ancient cultures, death was not a clean separation, it was a process, and the body stayed present in that process for far longer than you might expect. In sites across the ancient Near East and Southeast Asia, archaeologists have found skulls that were removed from burials after the flesh had decomposed, then plastered, painted, and fitted with shell eyes to recreate the face of the dead. These plastered skulls, as they are called, date back at least 9,000 years in places like Jericho. The dead were not gone, they were transformed. They were kept nearby. They were looked at, spoken to perhaps, made present in a way that blurred the line between living and dead in a manner that modern Western culture finds uncomfortable, but which was perfectly natural to minds shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of keeping the dead close. Some cultures carried the bones of their ancestors during migrations. Some ground ochre, a vivid red pigment made from iron oxide, and painted it onto the remains of the dead. Ochre has been found in burials dating back 120,000 years, spread across Africa, Europe, and Asia. Why red? Researcher Francesco Derrico, who studies pigment use in prehistory, suggests that ochre may have symbolized blood, life, or a connection to the living world, a way of giving back what death had taken. You were painting life onto the lifeless. Your ancestors were not afraid of death. They were in a conversation with it. Now here is the part that should stop you cold. None of this was taught. There was no ancient manual, no priest standing at the mouth of a cave explaining the proper procedure. No book, no law, no tradition passed down in writing. And yet, independently on nearly every continent where early humans left remains, archaeologists find the same impulse, to do something, to mark the moment, to make death meaningful. Anthropologist Paul Pettit, who has spent his career mapping the global emergence of mortuary behavior, argues that the urge to ritualize death may be one of the defining features of the human mind. Not a byproduct of religion or culture, but a precondition for it. Ritual came first, the explanations came later. You are not grieving because someone taught you how. You are grieving because 300,000 years of your ancestors grieved before you, and the impulse is written into your nervous system at a level that no amount of rationality can fully override. And here is what that means for you right now. The next time you feel that compulsive need to do something when someone dies, to clean, to cook, to gather people, to place flowers, to light a candle, to say words out loud even when no one is listening, understand that you are not being irrational. You are being ancient. You are doing what your species has always done. You are reaching across the silence the same way a Neanderthal reached for flowers in a field 60,000 years ago, and a child in Sungir was dressed in 10,000 hours of carved ivory, and a skull in Jericho was given back its face so the living could keep looking at it. Death has always been the moment your species refuses to simply walk away. Someone you loved is gone, and without anyone telling you to, you already know that leaving is not an option.